introduce our panel. We have Dr. Julia Khrebtan-Hörhager. She is Assistant Professor of Intercultural Communication at Colorado State University. Julia's research and teaching interests are inclusive to multiculturalism and transnational identity in Europe and the former Soviet Union. Prior to her academic career, Julia worked in Ukraine as a freelance journalist and as a Peace Corps liaison. Also on our panel, we have Betcy Jose, Dr. Betcy Jose. She is the assistant excuse me. She is the assistant professor within the political science department. Her specialties include international relations, international law, and human rights. Betcy is an expert on issues relating to international humanitarian law and recently authored an article in Foreign Affairs on the use of chemicals on civilians in Syria. She also recently contributed a blog to the Duck Minerva on the events in Ukraine that was widely recognized. And our final panelist, and who will be starting off today, is Dr. Christoph Stefes. He is the associate professor within the political science department, specializing in comparative European and post-Soviet studies. His research on political developments in the former Soviet Union has been published in several books and articles, and he has worked in research for almost 2 years in Georgia, Armenia, and Uzbekistan. So, ladies and gentlemen, I give you our panel.
Hello. So I think I was supposed to sit there, Betcy said sit, but I rather stand so I can move around. And, when you're so nervous, large panel, you just want to move around. So the title is a little bit provocative, right? War in Ukraine. There is fortunately no fighting war, at least right now, in Ukraine. And what we try to do today is try to explain to you what's going on there, why did it happen, and what might be the outcome. Right? Is there maybe going to be a war? Going through my Facebook lists and friends, there are some talking about the outbreak of World War III, and I think that is way beyond what we can currently imagine. So what's at stake? At stake is this wonderful country, Ukraine, which is really in the middle of Europe between Russia and bordering, I think, 6 European Union countries. What we are talking about today is particularly this peninsula, the Crimean Peninsula. Thank you. Right, we should ask the people who really speak that language, some German. No, ask the German, that's fine. So we talk about the Crimean Peninsula, and this is pretty much how it looks today, right? There are Russian soldiers controlling pretty much everything, every little piece of this peninsula, all the strategic positions, all the government offices, buildings, and they're controlling the port and they're controlling the airspace. Now, have the Russians never been there before? Of course they have been, because this has been the naval base for the Black Sea Fleet of Russia, only that they were usually staying on their ships and in their barracks and not controlling the rest of the peninsula. Okay, so this is what we're going to do today. I briefly start off with the timeline. What has happened? What do we need to know in terms of history, recent history, to understand what's going on? If you want a more deeper historical and cultural perspective, it's going to be Julia next, after I present you the timeline. I will then talk a little bit about what are Russia's larger geostrategic interests and how has the West so far responded or not. What does international law say, right? Are the Russians maybe totally legitimately occupying these territories of Ukraine or not? And Betcy will speak to that. After I will say a few more words about the West, and then I hope we have plenty of time for Q&A. Alright, so starting off with the timeline. As many of you know, hopefully all of you know, although you might have not been born then, in 1991, well, it's true. That is how we know that we are really old. What? what I would?
Speak for yourself.
So in 1991, the Soviet Union collapses, right? The Soviet Union is essentially an empire controlled by Russia. We have 15 independent states emerging out of the Soviet Union, one of which is Ukraine. From 1991 until 2004, Ukraine is ruled by two, what we would call semi-authoritarian leaders, right? They're somewhat democratically elected, but then don't really care too much about democracy thereafter. The names are Kravchuk and Kuchma. Both reach out to Russia on one hand and to the West on the other hand. They don't reach out much to Russia because there's nothing to gain from reaching out to Russia. In the 90s, we're going to go into that. There is really nothing to gain from Russia, right? They have so much problems on their own. They don't care. 2004, Kuchma is handpicking his successor, Yanukovych. You might have heard the name, that is the guy that has been just thrown out. And Yanukovych actually is forced to concede defeat, electoral defeat, against a very pro-Russian candidate, Yushchenko. In August 2008, Russian forces occupied two breakaway regions in Georgia. That's in the southern Caucasus, somewhere between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea, between Russia and Turkey. Ukraine at this side being pro-Western, as is Georgia, sides with Georgia. January 2010, after six pretty miserable years of pro-Western government in Ukraine, Yanukovych becomes president and defeats the pro-Western candidate Timoshenko, who then is sent to jail pretty much on trumped-up charges. In November 2013, Yanukovych terminates negotiations with the European Union for a closer economic integration of Ukraine into the European Union. Yanukovych was negotiating this economic integration deal for quite some time. In November, under heavy pressure from Russia, which starts to boycotting certain products from Ukraine and so on and so forth, Yanukovych decides it's not in the national interest of Ukraine to join or get closer to the European Union. Many people in Western Ukraine, and Julia will talk about why, especially there, didn't really like that idea, and we see massive anti-government protests in Kiev, capital of Ukraine, and all across Western Ukraine, which is pro-European. So until February 2014, these demonstrations go on and on. At the peak, we had about close to 1 million people demonstrating at once. We see very brutal dispersion. We see snipers from special police forces killing people. Yanukovych eventually has to concede defeat. He gives up. He flees Ukraine, goes to where? Surprise, Russia. And the parliament then dismisses Yanukovych and elects a new interim president. The new government is not accepted by Russia, I should mention that, but is fully accepted by the Western states. Then, just this Sunday, these Russian military forces on this naval base in Crimea swarm out. They get a lot of support then later from reinforcement of Russian troops and take over pretty much Crimea. Today, as I said, Crimea is entirely controlled by Russian military forces. New forces arriving still daily by air and sea. We see a lot of pro-Russian demonstrations, not only in Crimea, but also in the eastern and southern parts of Ukraine, which is a major reason for concern. And the European Union and the United States, determinedly think about what can we do about this and pass the far not come up with any really coherent or strong response to that, other than a lot of good words. Turning to the historical and cultural specific.
I'll take it from here. So as Christoph specified, the situation in Crimea, the situation in Ukraine, the situation in Russia is extremely loaded, but even more to that, it's extremely complicated. And in order to understand what's going on now, I invite you to revisit some pages of history of culture or cultures. This is what I'm going to do. I will talk to you about some complexities of Russian-Ukrainian relations. I'm emphasizing the word some because the biggest difficulty for me was trying to squeeze in the history of civilization that existed for centuries in 10 minutes. So I'll try to pick the most important things. Then we'll pay some tribute to the Heavenly Hundred. Christoph mentioned the dead. So right now, I just checked the German, the American, the Russian, and the Ukrainian media in the morning, just to give you a heads up on what is going on. The Ukrainian media reports that there are estimate of 300 dead. So when we talk about the Heavenly Hundred, we are talking about the people who fell, heroes who were unarmed, who fell victims to snipers, to special forces. But who is not mentioned, we also will talk a little bit more about people who were kidnapped, who were tortured, and so on and so forth. Then we'll talk about propaganda. That's why I called it the myth. Divided Ukraine, fascism, anti-Semitism, and many other crazy things you wouldn't believe you are reading when you would open any Russian site. Why? And this was the thing I was struggling with most. Russia is a very controversial country. Statistically, 99% of the Russians are literate, educated people. 99%. Given that numbers, you would ask yourself, how can it be that they still buy into the rhetoric of the president? And one of the answers I'm trying to give would be in the legacy of the totalitarian state. That's why we will go back in time and we'll revisit some Stalin pages and what I prefer to call ethnic lab, and we'll also analyze the conditions that allowed Putin to become a star in 2000, and also we'll see the controversies of his government. We'll analyze his persona just a little bit. So, well, the challenging part. Ukraine prides itself in being actually the cradle of what we consider today the Russian civilization, because things happened in Ukraine before Russia even existed. In the city of Kiev, Christianity started in Ukraine. So one of the reasons these two peoples talk about being brotherly nations goes back in centuries. Relationships between the two have always been complicated. Look at the date, 1654, Pereyaslav Agreement, Ukraine was transformed into the province of the Great Russian Empire, its warehouse and supplier. What happened? In one of its multiple attempts, Ukraine tried to be independent, yet couldn't do it on its own. Poland was too mighty. Poland united with Lithuania. Ukraine needed help, asked for help from the big brother, Russia. Russia said, okay, let's unite. Let's unite, we'll take care about you, we'll help you. It was a very promising manifesto. However, it didn't end well for Ukraine because Ukraine basically became colonized by what at that time was the Great Russian Empire. Russia continued its so-called ideological war during the Soviet era. That's why we talk about mass deportation, exiles, famine, which is incredible if you think about the agricultural structure of Ukraine. To create hunger in Ukraine, you have to be an evil genius. We'll talk about this later. So, what else? The breakup of the the USSR, of the USSR. We all know what USSR stands for. Okay, granted Ukraine its independence. Finally, there was a lot of hope. Ukraine wanted to join both the European Union and NATO, but of course these two moves were severely criticized by Russia. There were other attempts to establish democracy and freedom in Ukraine. Some successful, some not that successful. Christoph will talk a little bit more later about all the political implications of the Orange Revolution. Let me just tell you that the relations, as they are now, are very complicated. I would summarize them best as love-hate relations. Ukraine, for centuries, Ukraine was under Moscow's brutal rule, but Ukraine was also the most favored of all Russian possessions, if you wish. Back to Maidan. You might find a lot of heartbreaking pictures, and every time I revisit the rhetoric of Maidan, I cannot stop crying. Maybe because I have close ties to the country, maybe because I'm a mother, and thinking about young boys, students, who fell victims to fully armed special forces, snipers, is just too heartbreaking. So when you look at this, how many hundred were killed by bullets from special force snipers? To give you a little bit more of background information, Ukraine is poor. Right now it's a struggling country. Its special forces, Berkut, are one of the best paid forces you can think of. So, a lot of money will be at stake. You can understand what was going on. When you look at the rhetoric of loss, when you look at the number of people killed in the brutalities of Maidan, you will understand that some facts are just undeniable. Death is real. It's not some kind of performance. It's not some kind of staged performance organized by the evil United States, as Putin would love to present it to the world today. That's why what surprises me again and again is the propaganda from Russia. Look at this. Maidan protesters were Nazis. They hate Jews, they're old-fashioned, they're gangsters, they're imperialists. What else? Oh, Maidan was organized and sponsored by the United States. You didn't know? Now you know. What is heartbreakingly sad about that particular statement? A lot of people, common people, people not even with any political agenda, who were just suffocating in the very corrupt environment, were protesting on Maidan. They were kidnapped and brutally tortured to the point where, ears were cut off and they were made, they were forced to sign, yes, I'm an American spy, to have some evidence. Speaking of some interesting KGB methods, what I prefer to say today is you can take the president out of the KGB, but you cannot take the KGB out of the president. That being said, special forces, fully armed and trained Berkut, were victims. Not the executors, not the perpetrators of provocations and aggressive attacks. So what else? Ukraine is clearly divided into two Ukraines. Nope. Granted, one part of Ukraine is more Russian-speaking, and it has closer ties, not only linguistically, but also because of previous migrations, forced migrations, but still, Ukraine doesn't want to be in the war, and Ukraine doesn't want the division. This is also a piece of propaganda. And what else? The Russians, the poor Russians, are under attack and need protection and liberation. In cultural studies we say one country's terrorist is another country's freedom fighter. A lot is about one simple and powerful word: perspective. You can call it liberation, you can call it invasion, depending on the context, depending on the outcomes, and depending most importantly, on the goals you want to achieve. That brings me a little bit back. How can we have this mentality, this very brainwashed mentality in Russia today? Maybe we should go a little bit back in history and see what happened before that created this framework. Pre-Soviet heritage, the great Russian Empire. Why am I mentioning this? You have to understand the word great is important. Coming from, so first their aspiration of empire, then totalitarian regime, but again, the greatness is the word. Before 1917, most of the territory of the USSR was part of the Russian Empire with its capital in Moscow. One important day I picked, 1712, Tsar Peter the Great moved the capital St. Petersburg as a window on the west. St. Petersburg is the birthplace of our president, Mr. Putin. I'm saying our, meaning we're in the Russian well right now. Don't get me wrong here. So why was St. Petersburg a very important city for almost 2 centuries? Finally, Russia could compensate for its initial shortcomings of not having access to water. So we have a fleet naval base. Why am I mentioning this here? Because it's important to understand why the city of Sevastopol and Crimea is so important today. If you think about geography of Russia, fleet, you need to have fleet to be considered a very powerful empire. So waters are important, right? So what happens later? 1917, the revolution, power is in the hands of the communists, right? Bolsheviks, we have the power concentrated in Moscow again. What are the features? Dictatorship of proletariat, communism, repression, camps. When I say camps, it's not just a word. It's a national, post-national trauma. Let me just give you some statistics. The Second World War took away lives of 22 million Soviet people. Stalin's repressions took lives of 60 million people, which is almost the triple. For you to understand why any kind of critical, alternative thinking was punishable, okay? We also experienced militarization of the society, media isolation, the Iron Curtain. So this media isolation and having only one version of the truth is a common phenomenon in Russia because it's the heritage of the totalitarian regime it used to be in the Soviet Union. Ideology of a superpower forced Sovietization of identity. Yesterday, when I was putting together a couple of slides, I was struggling with this one. Sovietization of identity. Why? Because I could spend 5 hours trying to tell you what Sovietization, forced Sovietization of identity means, and I thought the best way would be for you to read the lyrics, the words of the national anthem of the USSR. Unbreakable union. Well, you can challenge pretty much every second word here. Unbreakable union, oops, of free-born republics, oops. Great Russia has welded forever to stand, oops. Created in a struggle by will of the people to be emphasized, whoops. United and mighty, our Soviet land, sing to the motherland, home of the free, my favorite, home of the free. Oops. Bulwark of peoples and brotherhood strong. The brotherhood is an interesting component. Of Party of Lenin, the strength of the people to communist triumph, led us on. It goes on and on, but I thought this would be enough for you to understand the cultural and political and ideological framework. To say the least, Putin is a product of that culture. Pretty much everybody 40 and up can identify with a lot of Soviet heritage still. Okay? So, we're talking about Crimea. We are talking about Crimea. Why is Crimea important? Not only because of its location, not only because of the fleet. Crimea is important because, again, demographically, it's a very complicated and long story. So native Crimeans, and why am I addressing this? Because Putin's claims of, oh, Crimea is Russian, we need to save it, are not that sound if you look at that history. So native Crimeans were predominantly Muslim Crimean Tatars, forcibly expelled to Central Asia by Stalin's government. That's why we talk about what? Ethnic lab. It's dangerous, move, remove. What else? After the fall of the Soviet Union, Crimean Tatars began to return to the region. What's happening today? Today we have approximately 60% of ethnic Russians, approximately 24-ish% of ethnic Ukrainians, and 12 and growing number of the ethnic Tatars. Where is the danger? The Tatars, A, they don't want any separation from Ukraine. B, they are thinking about asking Turkey for help. one of the things Putin doesn't want to happen. And back to Sevastopol. Sevastopol is a big city with a fleet. Why is it important? It gives access to Balkans, Mediterranean Sea and Middle East, so it has perfect size, location and infrastructure. So Putin's attempts to keep it in the Russian possession are, I wouldn't say legitimate, but I would say understandable. A little bit about Putin, revisiting his rise to power. As Christoph mentioned, and hopefully all of you know, no more USSR after 1991. Russia becomes the Russian Federation. Boris Yeltsin, the first president of Russia, was promising at the beginning, yet his presidency was marked by corruption, favoritism, and oligarchy. I'm not even going to talk about his drinking and some planes never landed, or Ireland, and many other embarrassing moments in history because we just won't have time for this. Let's put it this way. The country needed a new man who would be different, who would lead the country into the bright future. The country needed somebody different. Somebody different came in 2000. Russia's second president, Vladimir Putin, he initiated reforms in the economy and legislature and cut back military expenditures. He promised to combat corruption, favoritism, and oligarchy. What he forgot to mention, that instead of having the old corrupted team, he will install his own post-KGB team. It was never mentioned. What else? Putin's term was marked by problems in Chechnya, to put it mildly. Christoph will explain more how important and how drastic those were. So basically in 2004, Putin used tensions with Chechnya as a justification to consolidate power in his hands and to protect Russia from the terrorists. Two more things. One, at the very beginning, Putin was extremely popular in Russia. He was everything Yeltsin was not. He wanted to deconstruct oligarchy. He put Khodorkovsky in jail. He wanted to send the message, we're not going to be famous as the country of drinking people. He doesn't drink, he's an athlete. We're not going to talk about him topless on the course. Just not the framework for this. And most importantly, he was one of our people. You would see a lot of news reporting showing pictures. Oh, Putin is on the bus. He's one of us. He's one of the people's guys. He really cares. In 2005, this is probably, Putin's quote might summarize for you Putin's entire persona. He declared that the Soviet Union, the termination, disintegration of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. As for the Russian people, it became a genuine tragedy. Tens of millions of our fellow citizens and countrymen found themselves beyond the fringes of Russian territory. To be precise, currently we talk about 25 million of ethnic Russians dispersed in the former Soviet republics. Putin wants to liberate and unite them all. With this, I'll give you Christoph.
So during the 1990s, as Julia already mentioned, Russia was in a terrible situation. It was economically the breakup of the Soviet Union and the breakup of communism and the rapid introduction of capitalist institutions created mayhem for many Russians, who lost everything. We have seen, Yeltsin stelling his own parliament in 1993, so we have this division, this political division, deep political divisions in the country. There is kind of democracy, but it doesn't really work, partially because of Yeltsin and his alcoholism, really, frankly. So Russia is politically and economically weak, and what the West is doing, to give a fair picture, is that the West broke many promises when the Soviet Union collapsed in the late 80s, early 90s, when the West promised that NATO, for example, would not expand eastward. but immediately did, right? So when Germany was reunified, the 4+2 negotiations that took place promised Russia that, for example, no NATO troops would be stationed in East Germany. It took, I think, less than 2 or 3 years for NATO troops to arrive in East Germany. So it was clear that the West was taking advantage, if you want to use that strong word, of the very difficult situation of Russia to move the European Union and NATO closer and closer to Russia. Until 2000, Putin's rise to power, Yeltsin was in no position to do anything about that. Right? He was way too busy with keeping himself in charge, which he hardly succeeded, and to keep the economy somehow afloat, which in the late 90s really tanked due to the financial crisis that hit Russia at that time. With Putin's rise to power in 2000, everything changes, right? First of all, the democratic experiment is abandoned. Today, Russia is clearly a dictatorship. There's no word anymore that this could be potentially a democracy. He has re-centralized power in the presidency and through his governing party, United Russia. The economic resources are put directly under the control of the Kremlin through what you mentioned before, his old buddies from the FSB, who are put in strategic positions in Gazprom, for example, the biggest gas company in the world, and several other oil, aluminum, chemical companies. And what we see here is the development of a very coherent and very assertive foreign policy doctrine. And I'm going to talk about this for a moment. Putin's foreign policy doctrine has several pillars. The one first is that he is now taking a strong stance in the UN United Nations Security Council and opposing many of the Western proposals for intervening in other countries. Of course, the critique is well taken. It often lines up with China, another great democratic power in the world. So that was ironic. So someone would, it searches for authoritarian allies around the world. We see it in North Korea, we see it in Iran, providing a lot of support. Pipeline politics are very important, right? So Russia is full of gas and oil, but it needs to get it out of the country, and the best paying markets are in the West. So it builds all these pipelines through Ukraine, Poland, with German help through the Baltic Sea, and it uses these pipelines to shut them on and off depending on, if the people are nice to him, as the surrounding neighbors or not. It also gives special prices, special cheap gas prices to friends like Belarus and Armenia, and hikes up the gas prices for not so friendly countries, for example Ukraine after 2004, the Orange Revolution. Russia developed something that is very close to the American Monroe Doctrine, right? Russia essentially says there is a backyard that we control in which the West has nothing to do. And that, by and large, overlaps with the territory of the Soviet Union, minus the 3 Baltic states. So essentially, Russia says to the West, stay out of our spheres of influence. And the spheres of influence are Central Asia, the South Caucasus, Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova. And in 2011, he says, let's unite. We tried the Commonwealth of Independent States in the 90s, which was kind of an economic union which never really took off. Let's make it this strong union like the European Union, the Eurasian Union, as a counterpart or like even a challenger of the European Union. And that, and that would include pretty much, when you look at this, would include all of Central Asia over here. It would include these countries down here in the South Caucasus, Armenia, this is Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Armenia down here, and over here Ukraine and Belarus, and down there Moldova, which is also a divided country because there is an ethnic Russian minority living on the other side of a river, which has largely Transnistria, which has largely is a de facto separate state, more or less functioning. All right, so this is essentially what Russia thinks is the sphere of influence. And since the West has already encroached on this territory that now the Russians think is their sphere of influence. The clash between the West and Russia is inevitable, right? So until from 2003 on until 2005, we see three major revolutions and several attempts throughout the former Soviet Union to overcome dictators that were more or less friendly to Russia. So in 2003 in Georgia, when Shevardnadze was toppled by Saakashvili, in 2004 in Ukraine, 2005 in Kyrgyzstan, and then several attempts in Uzbekistan. Did I miss something? I probably, but bear with me. So the Russians, of course, think, or the Russian president thinks, that this is manufactured by the West. And it's true that the West had sympathies for those people that toppled, but there was no real major active support from the West for those that overcame the dictators. After these revolutions, Georgia and Ukraine turned clearly towards the West. They are looking for stronger links with the European Union. They look with military cooperation with NATO. Russia is furious about this, right? Georgia immediately, Georgia's most important export goods are immediately boycotted, right? The mineral water, the wine, is not being to be exported anymore to Russia because of hygienic standards or whatever. So in 2008, Russia takes, and this is important because this is a lot what's going on in Crimea right now. In 2008, Georgia had two separatist regions, and it was an uneasy truce between the central government and Tbilisi and these breakaway regions. Now, we don't know exactly what happened, but from what I understand, what happened is that South Ossetian forces, which is one of this breakaway region, started shooting Georgian villages which in this enclave, and then the Georgian military intervened and shelled essentially South Ossetia. The Russians had already lined up on the other side of the Caucasus mountain and moved quickly down and of course crashed the tiny little Georgian military. So the Russians are now in Georgia, full strength, control both territories, encroaching more and more into the territory of Georgia, which is pretty frightening to the Georgians. After that, and around the same time, Russia puts a lot of pressure on Central Asian and Armenian governments, puts them under economic and diplomatic pressure to remove Western military forces. You remember, there was this little war in Afghanistan that the United States fought, still is. Well, they needed bases in Central Asia to reach Afghanistan. Initially, Russia was supportive of these bases because fighting, Islamic terrorists was in the interest of Russia. But then soon Russia actually forced Kyrgyzstan, forced Uzbekistan to tell the Americans to pack up and leave. Armenia wanted to also join this European Union economic agreement with closer economic ties with the European Union. It would put a lot of pressure because it has a truce, an ongoing conflict which was once hot military with Azerbaijan over territory by threatening to supply Azerbaijan with weapons. Right? So the Armenians are very reliant on Russian forces to defend it historically, right, against Turkey, but also right now because of Azerbaijan. And Russia says, if you're not turning away from the European Union, Azerbaijan will be our new friend. And then, of course, 2014, right, the Maidan, the kicking out of Yanukovych, the pro-Russian president, leading Russia once again, like in 2008, to invade essentially another country. So what are the legal implications of that? I have no idea. Unfortunately, someone knows that.
So first of all, I want to thank all of you. We all appreciate you coming out here on this gorgeous day to talk about a really important global event. So Christoph and Julia had the Herculean task of talking about very complicated matters in a very short period of time. And I think they did a really good job of giving us a sense of why we are in the predicament that we're in right now. what I'd like to do is to talk about some of the legal issues that are at play in this situation, and I'm going to frame that discussion in the following way. What I'd like to do is to start off talking about when armed force can be used in international law. Russia is claiming that its presence in Ukraine is consistent with international law. So I want to talk a little bit about what some of those claims are and how they fit with dominant interpretations of international law, whether they hold up to the standards that many members of the international community hold in terms of when states can use force in international law. As much as Russia is using these claims of legality for its presence in Ukraine, a lot of people, a lot of actors in the international community don't find those arguments credible. They're not persuaded by those arguments. And so therefore they conclude that Russia has violated international law by using force in Ukraine. So if that's the case, what are some possible responses to violations of international law that the international community could possibly take? Because I've outlined a few of them, and I'll talk about each of those in turn. And then lastly, particularly among international law scholars, there's a great raging debate about the effectiveness of international law, particularly in the context of this situation as a way of restraining states. And there are arguments for and against that the situation in Ukraine actually does reflect the ability of international law to control and manage states in the global arena. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of that debate at the end of my presentation. Okay, so the use of armed force in international law, as most of you, all of you probably know, the use of force in international law is prohibited, and you have I have the provision in the UN Charter that explicitly states that the use of force in international law is prohibited. That being said, the prohibition on the use of force is not absolute. So there are exceptions where the use of force is permitted under international law, and I'm going to talk about 3 of them. And those 3 include when the UN Security Council authorizes the use of force, when the use of force is for self-defense purposes, and when a country uses force in another country with that country's consent. Okay, so one of the exceptions to the prohibition of the use of force under international law is when the Security Council actually authorizes the use of force. So the Security Council is one of the principal organs of the United Nations, and it is mandated with maintaining international peace and security in the global arena. And one way that it can do that is to authorize the use of force. And here's a provision that enables the Security Council to authorize the use of force for peace and security purposes. And this is what we saw with the Libya situation, for example. NATO was allowed to legally use force in Libya because the Security Council had authorized it to use force as a means of ensuring peace and security in the international arena, because the sense was that the Libyan conflict was a threat to international peace and security, and the best way to reestablish peace and security was through the use of military force by NATO. So NATO was able to use force legally in Libya because it had Security Council authorization. The other way that countries can use force legally under international law is through self-defense. So, of course, the Security Council is quite interested in maintaining peace and security in the international arena. But in order to maintain peace, it's not necessarily going to sacrifice the security interests of states. So when states face aggression by other states, they are allowed to repel that state or respond to that force with self-defense use of force. And this is what the United States did when it went to war with Afghanistan in the aftermath of the September 11th attacks. It used a self-defense argument to use force in Afghanistan legally. And then the third exception to the prohibition on the use of force is consent, right? So when a country allows another country to use force in its borders. And this is what Yemen or Pakistan does when it allows the US to launch drone strikes within its territories. those uses of force by the United States are considered legal because the U.S. has the consent of Yemen and Pakistan in those cases. So that is not considered an illegal use of force. And I should say at this point, I'm only talking about the use of force, so when countries can take up arms against each other. I'm not talking about how they use that force against individuals, against, say, civilians, for example. There's another body of law that regulates that kind of behavior once the resort to force is taken. So I'm only talking about when countries are allowed to use force. The body of law, international humanitarian law, which regulates how countries use that force, is a different matter. I'm not going to talk about that in my presentation, but we certainly can talk about that during the Q&A if that's something that you're interested in. So I'm just talking about when countries can actually go and use force. What are the permissible ways under international law? Okay, so as I mentioned, Russia has claimed that its use of force in Ukraine is legal under international law. So how do those arguments fit with these exceptions to the prohibition on the use of force that I just mentioned? There is no Security Council authorization here, right? So clearly, the Russian use of force in Ukraine wouldn't fit within this particular exception to the use of force. So that doesn't work for Russia. Self-defense. Can Russia claim that it has a self-defense exception to the use of force, the prohibition to the use of force in this case? One of the arguments that Russia has been making in terms of the self-defense exception is captured in this image here, and it's kind of fuzzy, I apologize for that. But Russia is saying that ethnic Russians and Russian citizens in Crimea are being threatened. Their lives are in danger, and as a result, Russia has to step in to protect them from any potential threats that they may face. There is some precedence in international law for countries to legally use force in another country for the protection of their nationals. If you think about the U.S. and Grenada some time ago, where the U.S. went into Grenada, used force ostensibly as one of the reasons that it went in to protect U.S. medical students who were living in Grenada. So we have seen examples of this argument being used for self-defense, as a self-defense exception to the prohibition on the use of force. The way that this is going to work, though, is how well you convince the international community that your nationals are actually being threatened, right? So if you can make the strongest case that you can make that there is actually a threat, that it's a credible threat, and that it's tangible, the more successful you are in making this claim. And as you can see with the quote on the bottom from Secretary of State John Kerry, there are members of the international community who are not buying this argument. Russia has not produced enough evidence to convince members of the international community that Russian citizens are actually under threat in Crimea. And so this would be a difficult argument for Russia to prevail on, to argue that its use of force in Ukraine is legal. Okay, what about consent? That was another exception to the prohibition on the use of force. As you can see here on the screenshot, Russia is also claiming that it actually has the consent of the ousted president of Ukraine to go in with military force to provide stability in Ukraine and to protect people living in Ukraine. So would this fall under the consent exception to the prohibition on the use of force? Again, it's how credible your claim can be. And in this case, the question that comes to mind is who can provide consent to use force in a particular country, right? Russia is claiming that Yanukovych does have the authority to give consent to use force in Ukraine. But others, as the UK ambassador to the UN states, are not convinced. And that's because of facts on the ground. Yanukovych is not in Ukraine anymore. He doesn't have control of the government. In fact, he has been impeached by the parliament, the Rada, is that the name of the parliament? Yes. Although whether that's been constitutional or not is up for debate. But in any case, there is uncertainty as to whether Yanukovych can legitimately claim to provide consent for Russian use of force in Ukraine. And so this is another argument that would be difficult for Russia to prevail on in claiming that its actions in Ukraine are legal. So that being said, I think the general opinion in the international community is that Russia has violated international law by going in and using force in Ukraine. And I should note at this point that the title of our panel is War in Ukraine ? With the use of force in Ukraine, under international law, technically there is a state of war between Ukraine and Russia. Even though hostilities haven't been exchanged between the two militaries, the fact that Russia is in Ukraine without Ukrainian consent would trigger the beginning of an armed conflict, an international armed conflict under international law. Even though Ukraine has not resisted the Russian presence with military force, the fact that it's there without Ukrainian consent and occupying a portion of Ukraine would be considered the start of an armed conflict under international law. So at least from an international law perspective, there isn't a question. Whether that turns into a mutual, exchange of hostilities between the two militaries is a different story. Russia has violated international law. What are some options that members of the international community might have in responding to this violation of international law? Well, for Ukraine, clearly Ukraine has a legitimate recourse to the use of self-defense in response to Russian presence in its country. And again, going back to the UN Charter, the Charter language does provide Ukraine with this right of self-defense. So it clearly can do that. It would be legitimate use of force under international law. So Ukraine can use force in its self-defense. But as I mentioned earlier, the UN Charter does allow for the collective use of self-defense. The Security Council, again, going back to Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, does enable the international community to come collectively to use force in the self-defense of another country. And so that's possible. That's a possible option. The problem with this is, okay, so when you have Security Council resolutions, they die whenever a permanent member of the Security Council vetoes that resolution. Russia has veto power in the Security Council, and it can vote on resolutions that impact it. So if the Security Council manages to draft a resolution calling for the use of force, Russia will veto that resolution. And so it will die and it won't ever see the light of day. So the likelihood that the Security Council will authorize the collective use of force in Ukraine is very, very unlikely. So that possibility is not really available for Ukraine. There's something that hasn't really been used a lot in terms of providing approval for the collective use of self-defense through the UN. There is a sense that the Security Council is the only principal organ in the UN that can provide approval for the use of force by member states. But technically that's not true. The General Assembly can actually provide approval for the use of force by member states. The General Assembly is another principal organ of the United Nations. And back in the 1950s, it was dealing with a crisis on another peninsula, the Korean Peninsula. And at the time, the Security Council was deadlocked on using force on the Korean Peninsula because the Soviet Union at the time was issuing vetoes on UN resolutions regarding the Korean Peninsula. And so the General Assembly is looking at this and saying, we've got to do something about the situation, and we can't allow the Security Council to be deadlocked on this matter. So it decided to pass a resolution, a General Assembly resolution, called the Uniting for Peace Resolution, which essentially said, yes, we, the General Assembly, know that the Security Council is the principal organ that is tasked with dealing with peace and security issues, and therefore we, the General Assembly, cannot address peace and security issues that the Security Council is dealing with. But the Security Council is not doing anything. So technically, there's a gap on this matter. So we're going to step in and deal with this peace and security issue. We're going to give ourselves the capacity to deal with this issue that is typically under the mandate of the Security Council. And this has been done a couple of times. It's Uniting for, not a couple of times, a handful of times. The Uniting for Peace resolution has been utilized by the General Assembly to provide approval for the use of force in the international arena. I think the last time they did this was in Somalia, I think. I could be wrong, but I think that's right. So this is a possibility for getting approval from the UN to use force in Ukraine when the Security Council is likely unable to provide that authorization. The General Assembly might be able to do that. There are some problems with this approach, which is one reason why it probably hasn't been used that much. So when the Security Council considers a resolution, remember I said that as soon as a permanent member vetoes it, it's dead and it goes nowhere. With General Assembly resolutions, especially on important matters like peace and security issues, you just need 2/3 majority of the member states to pass the resolution in the General Assembly. And so even if one of the permanent members decides to vote against a General Assembly resolution, it can still pass as long as it has the support of 2/3 of the members of the General Assembly. So it's easier in some ways to get a resolution passed to the General Assembly. You don't have to worry about vetoes killing off resolutions. The problem is, though, is that remember that the Security Council is mandated with making sure that the international arena is peaceful and secure. So its resolutions to use force as an exception to the prohibition on the use of force are legal. But the legal status of General Assembly resolutions that provide approval for the use of force are debatable. It's not clear that General Assembly resolutions that allow for the use of force are legal. So sometimes states back away from that because they're concerned about legal liability for using force according to a General Assembly resolution. The other difference is that General Assembly resolutions are non-binding, whereas Security Council resolutions are. So General Assembly resolutions can't compel states to engage in any particular kind of action. They can only advise and provide approval for actions, but they can't compel states. So there is a possibility to go through the General Assembly, although it doesn't have the teeth of a Security Council resolution. Okay, so I've talked about Ukrainian self-defense and I've talked about the use of force through the UN. What are some options besides those two options? Well, we've got the International Criminal Court. Here's a picture of it. It's in The Hague. The International Criminal Court was created to hear cases that involve individuals, which is different from the International Court of Justice, which is another one of the principal organs. And I apologize for the quality of the images. The International Court of Justice is another principal organ of the UN, and the blue boxes in the graphic on the right indicate the principal organs. The International Court of Justice hears cases between countries. The International Criminal Court hears cases that involve individuals. So if the case between the Ukraine and Russia were to be heard before the International Criminal Court, you would be prosecuting individuals as opposed to, say, Ukraine or Russia, which would be the case with the International Court of Justice. There are problems with looking to the International Criminal Court to step in, much like the case of the Security Council. The first problem is neither Ukraine or Russia have ratified the Rome Statute, which created the International Criminal Court. So the International Criminal Court actually does not have jurisdiction over them. However, as you can see here, the screenshot on the right, people within Ukraine have asked the International Criminal Court to step in. The legislature actually formally asked the ICC to step in and investigate crimes that are alleged to have been committed prior to the Russian invasion. And the former president of Ukraine has asked the ICC to step in and investigate Russian actions in Ukraine. Those aren't enough for the ICC to have jurisdiction on the situation in Ukraine. Ukraine actually has to go and formally ratify the Rome Statute in order for the ICC to be able to step in and have jurisdiction over what's happening in Ukraine. That being said, it's not the case that the ICC can never hear situations that involve non-member states. So for example, the ICC has issued an arrest warrant for the Sudanese president. Sudan is not a member of the ICC, never ratified the Rome Statute. So how is it the ICC can issue this arrest warrant for the Sudanese president? The way that that works is there's this close relationship that's between the Security Council and the ICC that's written into the Rome Statute, which created the ICC. And that is, when the Security Council thinks that there's a situation of involving peace and security that could be handled and addressed by the ICC, the International Criminal Court, the Security Council can actually refer that situation to the ICC. So it can actually refer countries that aren't members of the ICC to be investigated by the ICC. So that's what happened with Sudan. The Security Council referred the situation in Sudan to the ICC, and therefore that enabled the ICC to have jurisdiction over what was happening in Sudan, okay? So that could be possible here. Remember, Russia and Ukraine are not members of the ICC. But remember, Security Council resolutions, right? Security Council is what's going to refer the situation to the ICC. Russia's got a veto in the Security Council. That resolution is not going to pass. So the ICC is not going to have jurisdiction over the situation in Ukraine in that way. But even if it did, even if it was able to hear cases, the case of Russian invasion of Ukraine, there are issues of whether what's happening on the ground in Ukraine actually fall within the substantive jurisdiction of the ICC. The ICC only has jurisdiction over 4 crimes, the 4 most heinous and grave crimes in international law, crimes of genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes of aggression. At this point, the situation between Ukraine and Russia would not fall within one of these 4 crimes. They have it hasn't the sufficient gravity, as we like to say, in international law. So even if the ICC was able to bring Ukraine and Russia before it, it still may not have jurisdiction because substantively it doesn't have jurisdiction over what's happening in Ukraine. Sadly, if the situation got worse, then maybe the ICC could actually step in. So going to the ICC is probably difficult in this situation. Other non-armed conflict responses, I'm going to speed up because I'm running out of time. The Security Council can impose economic sanctions, so it doesn't necessarily have to always use force to punish violators of international law. But again, because of the Security Council, there were concerns that Russia will veto any measures to punish it. So, in a sense, we can't go to the Security Council to deal with the situation in Ukraine. But that doesn't mean that the UN is completely invisible in this situation. It certainly can use diplomacy. It had actually sent an observer mission in Ukraine to gather facts on the ground. In fact, I was just reading this morning that the UN Special Representative was actually on the ground in Ukraine, was almost kidnapped by armed men, sort of locked up in a cafe, and until somebody came in and intervened and released him. And so he promptly decided to leave the Crimea. So the UN does have a presence, but it's a tough challenge for the UN in terms of, at least at a minimum, trying to investigate what's happening on the ground there. There's also the possibility for unilateral actions. So the US is contemplating enforcing economic sanctions against Russia. This is actually part of a package that emerged out of the negotiations for Syria. But the US never imposed those sanctions because it was trying to get cooperation from Russia on the Syrian situation. But now the US might be motivated to actually impose those sanctions because of a way of sort of punishing Russia for its international law violations. Okay, and then I'm just going to conclude with sort of this, a brief discussion about what are the implications of international law. It sort of seems like from my discussion that international law is pretty useless at this point. It hasn't been able to do a whole lot here, right? And that's true to an extent. If we're talking about the ability of international law to prevent Russia from going into Ukraine without Ukraine's consent, absolutely. International law hasn't done a whole lot there. But that being said, while it hasn't been able to prevent Russia from going into Ukraine without Ukrainian consent, and so it's violated international law in that way, those who advocate for the continued relevance of international law will say that there are other ways that Russia could have violated international law in this move into Ukraine, excuse me. It hasn't done that. It's actually been pretty restrained as far as the situation could possibly go. And that could be a reflection of the restraining influence of international law. Additionally, as we talked about with the Russian arguments for the legitimacy of its presence in Ukraine, we see that it's actually resorting to international law to justify its actions. So there is a sense that international law is important in some way or another. That it can't be completely dismissed. It has some utility in some fashion, and it's important to some people. Lastly, the fact that there's been widespread condemnation for this violation of international law also suggests that international law is important to the international community, and it's something that the international community wants to preserve. So when we're thinking about the utility, the effectiveness of international law, some would argue that we don't just look at the violations, but we look at the entirety of the situation to get a more comprehensive sense of what role international law has played in that particular situation. So I'm going to conclude my portion of the discussion and hand it back over to Christoph.
So what will be the actually? I mean, we know now that it was a clear violation of international law. What will the West do? And I'm sorry to say, I don't think that the West will do much. It has already not done much in Georgia in 2008, right? The United States, close ally of Georgia, does not come to the rescue when Russia invades Georgia. The EU in 2008, especially my home country, Germany, does not even condemn Russia, but sees fault on both sides. And the West continues after 2008 to treat Russia as a partner, as a G8 member, grants Russia WTO membership, and so on and so forth. So if 2008 is any indication for what's going to happen in 2014, I can tell you not much is going to happen. So where does this Western tenderness come from? Well, I think first of all, the United States is pretty sick and tired of going all over the world and invading countries or getting engaged in military conflict. It is about to withdraw from Afghanistan, so it does not actually need Russia anymore down there in Central Asia, but it also does not need Central Asia as a strategic location anymore. And in terms of energy, the United States does not depend much on Russia for its energy. The European Union, on the other hand, has very strong economic ties with Russia, and it depends heavily on Russian gas, especially Germany. And the European Union plays a very different game than Russia, and that is very, it's like this kind of Mars versus Venus argument, right? It's this hard power versus soft power thing. So the European Union relies on soft power. It's something that the Russians simply do not respond to, right? This shows you a little bit the European dependency on Russian gas, and the dark red shows you 100% dependency on Russian gas. Germany is about 30, I think it's like about 40% of Germany's gas comes from Russia. So it's very dependent on gas. Now, I don't think that anyone currently thinks about using military force against Russia. That's out of the question. It could still happen, of course, because things could escalate. Let's hope not. But you can use economic sanctions on Russia. You could, for example, boycott Russian gas and oil. Will the European Union do that, or members of the European Union? No. You can forget that. I mean, this is way too expensive for them. You could freeze accounts of the Russian oligarchs in British banks, for example. Right? The British foreign minister already declared, not so much, right? Because the city of London very much depends on this Russian money that has been going into their accounts. So, what else? Well, you could say, we don't hand out visas to you Russians anymore. Okay, that can happen. I don't know how much Putin is going to be, intimidated by that kind of response. So, what are the scenarios? I mean, I think the most optimistic scenario currently is, the best scenario actually is that Crimea has a referendum soon deciding about the independence of Crimea. I think this will pass. There's no doubt about it. it will be then a sovereign state that will not be accepted by any other Western countries, by Russia, of course, and maybe Venezuela also, or some, some other odd countries around the world, but certainly not by the majority of the countries. So it becomes like South Ossetia and Abkhazia, which is like they are formally independent, like so it's declared, but they're totally dependent on Russia. So the more pessimistic, and that is frightening, this scenario, that is that since we see in the east of Ukraine pro-Russian demonstrations, that Russia will move north from Crimea and also come to the rescue of its ethnic Russians there. And then we would see the split up of Ukraine in two parts. Southeast going Russian, and the west, northwest going towards Europe. Done. So, thank you.